Filipino Ginunting sword is perhaps one of the most enigmatic swords in the entire catalog of Filipino bladed weapons. It stands out in terms of its design. There's something about its aesthetic that's very eye-catching. It is currently in use by the Special Forces in the Philippines, Force Marine Recon. And I would say that what I am holding here right now, which is the Tops Knives treatment of this specific design, none other than the X16 Ginunting. This magnificent piece of swordsmanship is perhaps, in my opinion, the best iteration of the Ginunting that I have held so far. This is one of those swords that, in my opinion, holds true to one of the main features of Filipino swords. It has a particular heft to it that, upon cursory observation, and when you first pick it up, the first thing you think is, whoa, this is a particularly heavy sword, and I'm not quite used to it. But as somebody who has dealt in Filipino swords and swords in general for most of his life, I would say that the X16 Ginunting is perfectly balanced, and in my opinion, this is how a Filipino Ginunting should feel like in your hand. It should feel very robust. It should feel like it can do true double duty in that it can do, and I'm going to say this in Tagalog, pangbukid. Pangbukid means this is for field, and pangtao for the purpose of combat. The X16 Ginunting was brought to my attention by none other than my good friend Tomas Alas of Tactical Tavern when I was recently at Blade Show 2025 in Atlanta. He said, hey, come along with me. Let me show you something. And he took me to the tops table. He had a chance to play around with the X16 Ginunting, and I wanted your thoughts on it. So at the table happened to be Tomas Alas, my girlfriend Robin, and members of the team at Tops Knives, specifically the president, Leo Espinoza, and their general manager, Craig Powell. When I first picked it up, I could tell that a lot of people, when they first pick it up, they're going to say, this is pretty heavy, they're not used to it. And that part I get, because in the American market, the majority of swords, even double duty, don't necessarily have the kind of heft that I'm used to seeing when it comes to Filipino swords. So when I first held this, the first thing I thought was, finally, a Filipino Ginunting. I shared it with Tomas, and I shared it with Leo, and I also shared it with Craig at the table, which prompted them to ask, why don't we send this to you and maybe you can do a review? And I said, yes. And so this is how the X16 Ginunting got into my hands. As preparation for this review so that I can provide maximum value for a series that I will be building for the X16 Ginunting, I went ahead and contacted the designer of the X16 Ginunting, none other than Adam Boyce, who is known as Spartan Mode on his Instagram handle. The main reason why I reached out to him is because the more time I spent with the X16, I saw that there were some things in the details, some things about it that led me to believe that whoever designed the sword had a very specific thought process in mind. So I wanted to get a chance to speak to him to get a little bit into that thought process, find out where some of the nuances were. The more time I spent with the X16, there were more details about the sword that I was discovering that I thought these were not here by accident. So I thought it best to reach out to the designer himself, Adam Boyce. So what I'll be reading to you is a little bit of the draft notes that I put together when I spoke to him for about a good hour and just kind of pick his brain in terms of what he was thinking when he first created the X16. Just a few things before I go over the draft notes that I put together when I was speaking to Adam Boyce. Adam Boyce is a full-time firearms instructor and CQB subject matter expert. So when it came time to designing the Ginunting, he was drawing up not only on his current professional vocation, but also his years of experience on the field and also as a martial artist. He actually, and I'm going to look at the notes now, so he actually started his martial art journey about 18 years ago, starting in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. During that time, he was actually accepted into a very specific special response team as a sniper and as an assaulter. He eventually became the defensive instructor for them. And one of the things that stood out was during that time was that some of the responses that were being taught something that he just felt wasn't quite up to par. So this started another part of his journey where he trained with Danny Nasanto, but then he ultimately landed with the instructor that he said ultimately changed his life. And that is none other than the founder of Martial Blade Concepts, Michael Janich. He continues to train with him, and he's been with him for about a good 10 years. He also reviews lesson plans and training procedures as a subject matter expert. One thing that I found really curious is that he has a degree in Idaho State University in adult learning. So this is a critical piece when it comes to speaking about Adam Boyce, in that adult learning is a very specific aspect of education, in that it's one thing to teach a child whose developmental process is going to be a little different than approaching an adult learner. So the fact that he has a degree in adult learning speaks well of him in terms of his ability to create processes for knowledge transmission when it comes to his specific subject matter expertise. One of the key data points that feeds into his design of the X16 Ginunting is that in one of the MBC camps that was being led by Mike Janich, they were provided, as part of their participation, a trainer for a Ginunting. And he said that this really left an impression on him because of the design of the sword. It wasn't about the same length of the X16. It's a little closer to about 12 to 14 inches in blade length. But regardless of this, the design of the Ginunting really captured his imagination because of all of its nuances that ultimately informed the swordsman's ability to deliver the appropriate strikes when it comes to combative applications. One thing that Adam did want me to point out is that the initial trainer that he received from Mike Janich actually had a false edge. And this is something that I was talking about with a good colleague of mine, Ryan Burkhart at RMJ, in that should he and I collaborate on a Ginunting, I would actually like to see a false edge on that very tip of the Ginunting. However, when we talked about some of the design considerations when it came to the X16, there were four things I wanted to address. The first part is this aspect of the Ginunting, where the false edge could have been. But for this one, as you can see, it's dull. In fact, it has a little bit more of a platform here, and it's very hard to see. I'm going to try to get a photo of it, but the ramp on this part, it's not really designed like a false edge. It's not sharp at all, but it's a little bit, it has a little bit of that scalloping that you see sometimes in very old katana. So the four parts that I want to talk about was where the false edge could have been, the spine of the X16, what's going on with the handle, specifically along the subhilt, and most of all, the puño that happens to have a lanyard. So in our conversation, when we were covering this, one of the things that did get brought up as it relates to the false edge is the fact that when he was creating the X16, he designed the X16 with the idea that he wanted to enter the Knife or Death show. And for those of you who don't know, the Knife or Death show was a spin-off of Forged in Fire. And the idea was that you would go through this obstacle course cutting all types of items. They could be blocks of ice, they could be plastic buckets suspended in the air that's full of ice, chopping through crates, or you could be slicing through salmon and chicken. But there were all types of things that the sword or the knife had to be able to handle. So when he created this X16, he had that kind of double duty in mind, but with the idea of making it through this very challenging obstacle course for this show. The show ended up getting canceled, so he did not end up on the show. But just to give you a little bit of background of what he was thinking when he first created this sword, this led to the decision for the false edge in that they didn't want a sharpened false edge for a very specific reason. There is a portion of that challenge where there is a suspended plastic bucket full of ice. And what they didn't want was for this to be sharpened, it would have to be narrowed. But as it would narrow, it would require for this to really start to come out in these very micro increments so that when you stab into the plastic bucket, if this primary edge was cutting through the plastic bucket, this part would be cutting also. And when you have those two lines of pressure going through that kind of material, it can get stuck. So what they opted with instead is this kind of almost ramp design for the Ginunting, and again, which I happen to like, so that when you push into that plastic bucket and this primary edge is slicing through the plastic bucket, this thicker material here is actually being pushed down by the plastic itself. And I mentioned in conversation with him that, you know what, this is something that Lynn Thompson had talked about when it came to the design of the Frenzy. Same exact concept, in that you want this back material here to be something that the material you're stabbing into to push into and not get stuck on. So I really like that, because as a stabber, you have this really nice angle and this very sharp edge and this beautiful needle point, so that when you stab through, it's slicing through and stabbing at the same time, while the material that's on top of this actually helps with the stab and or the cut. A lot of the inspiration for that exact dynamic that I was just speaking about came from Mike Janich's Yojimbo, which interestingly I have been looking at for a few years and finally got to handle when I was at Blade Show 2025 at the Spyderco table. Really great, but I particularly like the Yojimbo version, the bigger version of the Yojimbo. But same kind of idea with regards to the modified Warncliffe dynamic, what you see in the Yojimbo, and you kind of see that in the X16 as well. So if you're thinking Yojimbo, Yojumbo, Yo, X16, you're seeing a little bit of that Warncliffe dynamic happening here with the X16 Ginunting. The second portion of the sword that I found a lot of interest in, especially in my practice, was this spine. As you can see, there's a bit of a drop off here. So you have this flat platform, and then it kind of drops off very sharply, and it's hard to tell, but this widens out just a little bit, so that now I can kind of put my hand on it. So I had to ask Adam, hey, Adam, what was this? What were you thinking about when it came to this specific design? And he said that the idea was to remove material from this part of the sword, one, to keep it lighter, but also with the same exact idea for the show. If you have more material here and it's heavier, there's an opportunity for this spine. Sometimes if you chop through something and there's so much power going into it that you kind of get snagged. So the idea is that by making it lighter, you want to remove some of that material, so that by making it lighter, and you have to kind of either pull out of the target or push through the target, you have this opportunity over here. But when I had this conversation with him, I said, you know what I found interesting, and let me know what you think, is that in close quarters combat, especially in today's age, when most combatants don't even think in terms of their own survival, they kind of rush individuals, so that if they happen to have a sword or they happen to have an M16 rifle, they get rushed so that another person can go ahead and do the attacking, while the person rushing will actually help to immobilize. So what I thought would be a really good help for this is that if I happen to have the X16 in an angle number 1, and if someone is rushing me this way and I go into an angle number 2, I can either put my forearm, my palm, or my entire hand on it to apply my weight and drive momentum, so that I can either push cut through or slice down and out, and then I move on to the next person. This was something that he really liked, and this is his statement around this really stood out for me, because it spoke to the character of the man and to his integrity. He said, you know what? I really like this idea that you came up with, but in all honesty, when I first created it, it didn't occur to me that that's something that it could do. Speaks to his integrity, because quite frankly, he could have faked it, but he did agree that yes, that's a very good application for that part of the sword. The third thing that I had to ask him about was the handle design. And this is something that stood out to me when it came to the handle. Number one, you have this kind of mini sub hilt, just enough sub hilt so that my index finger can be placed around it, so I have a little bit of action going, but also just enough sub hilt so I have this kind of secondary grip if I need it. But the other thing I really love about this, and some of you who've been following the channel will know that this is a very big thing for me, in that in most Filipino swords, there is enough space so that I can two-hand the sword if need be. And I'm so glad that this is something that Adam Boyce created, because doing this, he can do what's called the Filipino grip. And the Filipino grip allows it so that it's more of a three-finger grip, and there's some flexibility in terms of the use of the index finger and along with the thumb, which happens to be right on top. But for his own purposes, he prefers the hammer grip, and sometimes he likes to choke up on it. This, to me, is where the real magic of the sword comes in, because when I first spoke to him about this, I said to him, Adam, what you have here really is two swords, because if I hold it down here, the movement dynamics of the sword is such so that it lends more towards some Ilustrisimo movement. But if I put it up here, not only do I have the snap cutting capability, which he said was intentional on his part. He said he created this so that you can snap cut with the Ginunting, but for my purposes, especially with the lanyard, and I wrap it around this way, this practically weds this sword to my hand so that when it drops into this 90-degree angle, this lanyard actually holds this kind of tension to hold the sword up. So now I can move more towards some Decuerdas, some of that clock template, so that instead of dropping all the way down, coming up on that angle 10 on the left femoral or the left armpit, I can in fact use the indexing so that when it drops on angle number 4, I could go to the shoulder, to the carotid, or use my left hand, apply pressure to that carotid, and move them forward with momentum or cut out. This X16 Ginunting is optimized not just for long range, but also for short range, but also power cutting and power pressuring. It allows me to access multiple paradigms in a way that is optimized and in a way that is fluid, so that if I have to move from one paradigm to another, I don't have to sacrifice my abilities because of the limitations of the weapon. This has become my favorite Filipino sword. A couple of things I asked him was, well, what would you change? What would you do? How would you address some of the conversations around, hey, this is a little heavy. Is there anything that we can do? I'm not going to do this for this episode, but it's hard to tell. But in the handle here, you have these liners. And guess what? All you have to do is take a nice torque wrench, remove the liners, and now you have a narrower handle. This actually is the preference of Adam Boyce when it comes to the handling of the X16. I'm going to be doing a second episode on the X16 as I build out the series, just to show you A, how to remove those liners, but also B, a comparison of biomechanics in terms of moving with the X16 with the liners and moving without them. But for this episode, we're going to be keeping the liners intact. I did also ask him, what are your recommendations to anybody who chooses to buy this X16 as it relates to training, as it relates to its intended use? He did say that if you're going to go ahead and train with it, he highly recommends that you train with it using the sheath, just to get used to the weight, but most of all so that you are safe. The way they designed the sheath, as you can see, that when I take the clasp off and now it is ready to be deployed, the deployment of the sword actually a pull up, so that you pull up on the sheath and then you can go ahead and deploy. The other part to it is this ring. The idea is that you attach this to your belt, holds on to the ring. And as you're securing it with the ring, you deploy the sword as it comes up and you pull the sword out. If you are a swordsman or a Filipino martial arts practitioner and you are looking for a Filipino sword, you're going to get maximum value with this X16 Ginunting. I absolutely love it. I think you should go ahead and get it because it's going to inform your Filipino martial arts biomechanics more than you realize. Thank you very much for letting me share, and I really hope you enjoy this video. Let's start by correctly deploying the X16 with the sheath right next to your hip. You grab the ring sheath and then unsnap the clasp. Right there, you grab the X16 and then you deploy it by pulling forward. The rest of the agenda for today is going to be grips, weight, orientation, anatomical indices, and systems and biomechanics. By taking a look at the grip first, you start to get an experience of what the weight is going to be and what systems and biomechanics are going to be necessary. This is a two-sword in one design, so this is something that I need us to pay really close attention to. The sword on my left hand is the Bicolano Minas Bod. If you want to learn more about it, I did do an episode on it a few months ago, so take a look at that. They feel and weigh pretty much the same, with the Ginunting weighing about 2 ounces more, although it is the shorter sword. So pay attention to how I'm gripping it. I'm gripping it in the exact same way, but when I relax my grip, notice how the Minas Bod actually drops into that angle number 10, while the Ginunting stays at the angle number 3. This is an important consideration because even though you're gripping it in the exact same way and they weigh the same, it is very clear from this demonstration, knowing the technical specifications of a sword, it cannot dictate our approach to that sword. So regardless of how it feels or how much it weighs, we have to approach it depending on what the sword demands. Because if we take a look at the X16 Ginunting with the same exact grip, it lands at an angle number 3. So this means that the sword itself, when we change our grip, is actually going to behave exactly like the Minas Bod. It's going to drop into that severe angle that goes below parallel. So when approaching the X16 and we take a look at what it can do, we have to consider multiple approaches because, like I mentioned, it is a 2-in-1 sword. Notice that when I go ahead and take a look at how both can do thrusting actions, keeping the wrist at roughly 90 degrees to the sword, the Ginunting lands right at the torso. So when I go ahead and thrust with it, we know based off of how much radial deviation I allow my wrist, it's going to land squarely. But this is very different with the Minas Bod. It is the edge that lands first. I have to really go into severe radial deviation in order to land there. The majority of Filipino martial artists come from primarily stick-based training. So what I'm going to demonstrate here is a relatively standard flow where I am using some pretty standard techniques, some witik, some X patterning, some figure eights, and the encouragement in the Filipino martial arts community is to take this relatively standard pattern and now go ahead and apply it to any weapon. But we can see that if we try to do this with the X16, with its unique dimensions and demands, we're going to start to fatigue the entire system. Just moving in this way, I can already start to feel tension in my neck and in my shoulders. So the demand here is that you approach the sword as a sword and you benefit from it primarily from a more multidisciplinary approach with an understanding of the biomechanics necessary to handle it. Firstly, let's take a look at the lanyard. The DNA of this sword is actually for competition cutting. This was originally designed by Adam Boyce for Knife or Death, which is as big a knife competition as it gets. So what this lanyard does is secure the blade in the hand. The next consideration is also the anatomical index. For this one, I want to keep my elbow as close to my body as possible. I am rotating primarily from my core and my hips so that I'm not using arm-centric movements. I am using my entire body's capability to deliver and generate the force necessary to move this sword. One of the important tactical considerations for the X16, but for the Ginunting design in general, is that when you're using this type of biomechanics, you take advantage of one of the unique design considerations of the Ginunting. The primary edge actually lands higher than the tip, so that when you're extracting the sword from a specific target, you're going to need that core activation just to get the sword out of the target. Notice that when I'm moving with the Ginunting, it falls in a certain way when I'm in the primary grip and falls in a different way when I am in the secondary grip. You can take this sword-based biomechanics and apply it to stick work, but it becomes more difficult if you take stick-based biomechanics and try to apply it to a sword. They're just very different. The first fundamental that I want us to take a look at for systems and biomechanics is Ilustrisimo. Once I secure the lanyard here, the first consideration as far as movement mechanics is to take that elbow and really partner it with the ribs. I like to use Ilustrisimo when I am holding the X16 in this secondary grip. So when I start to move in this manner, the X16 actually feels really maneuverable and somewhat weightless. So moving away from stick-based pedagogies and now moving into sword-based biomechanics, the X16 now becomes a better partner when I'm doing sword-based training. Even when I'm doing downward slashes, notice how my elbow is practically taped to my torso. The only time I deviate from this is when my elbow floats away from my body and I'm using an Ilustrisimo vertical. I use my left hand as a power assist so that I can still support the sword with my entire body. So this is the primary thing I want us to consider when we're using Ilustrisimo for sword-based biomechanics. Elbow in, power assist with the left hand. Now we're going to take a look at some other considerations relating to some tactical applications in the high line. One of the main concepts and tactical applications of Decuerdas is to consider the opponent's stick almost like a shield that we're trying to get around. So we're trying to get our weapon around it. So imagine that the center line is a stick, the bottom ball is being held by my left hand. So now I'm going to try to circle my weapon around it so that I don't have to beat the stick away with force. I just have to go around it. So notice how the Ginunting practically wraps around the stick or the sword that's in front of me. And this is an important design advantage of the Ginunting when applying Decuerdas. So I go around the stick or go around the sword using Decuerdas. Now I can go into the other techniques, which is called the wiper. 2 swords, 2 grips. So the first grip is primary. We can use highline Decuerdas attacks, or we can switch to that secondary lower grip and we can use low line Ilustrisimo attacks. But this also starts to inform us on how we can start to manage range with the X16, but it really depends on how we take advantage of the grip that Adam Boyce's design has made available to us. For example, I'm currently exploring how the X16 design integrates with my family's World War II Escrima combative system called Gahudo. It's a very versatile design, so it's important that we approach it with that mindset. Let's not try to impose what we know, and let's use the X16 as an opportunity to explore and learn. For example, I want to explore and learn what long-range management looks like with the X16. Can I use primarily a right side lead to it, or can I use my left hand to try and power assist? What are my level changes considerations? What are my postural considerations here? For example, as I try to explore what is available to me right now, one thing becomes very evident to me is that I can start to use some Dizon Mohara and even some Shinkaguryu biomechanics so that I can start to optimize this long range to close range capability of the X16 Ginunting. So let's see what's available to me. Some vertical, some Ilustrisimo, a bit of a redondo that tends to be happening here. Again, I'm looking at low line capabilities, long range capabilities, but all of this is coming from that secondary grip, which is on the lower portion of the handle. It's going to change when I go into that primary grip when my finger goes over that sub hilt. So when we start to explore those capabilities, the entire paradigm changes as well. So it's not as simple as what can the sword do, it's what I can do with the sword. So now let's see what happens when I go back to that primary grip. Adam Boyce did design this with a snap cut in place. This is a little more similar to what in Tagalog we call a tuka. Tuka means to peck or to sting. So using this particular technique to then allow an entry point for some mid-range techniques, some X-patterning into power assist, a little foray into lutang and some bagsak, but then from there I can use that entry, get my left hand in there, and once I'm in, I can use it as a fulcrum. Once I'm inside, I can really go to town with the X16 Ginunting. Perhaps the most important feature of the X16 Ginunting that really got me excited, and this is something I didn't tell Adam when I was speaking to him, so Adam, you're hearing this for the first time, is the first sword that fully allows me to utilize the Dizon Mohara system, where I can change grips in mid-fight, so I can also change the range without letting the opponent know while holding it with just one hand. So the opponent never really knows whether he is in short range or long range, or whether I'm going to go and use a two-handed grip on the sword. That opponent never really knows, and this is the first sword that I've handled that allows me to explore the Dizon Mohara system beyond its stick-based origins. I can actually use a lot of those techniques and use it for a sword. For example, the advanced Mohora Doblete technique, which is primarily to injure not only the weapon hand but also to try to beat the stick out of the opponent's hand. But with this, I can use it so that I can make these small cuts not only into his weapon but also into his weapon hand. But this is only allowed because of the very versatile design that Adam Boyce created in the X16 Ginunting. So I'm very thankful for him. It's allowed me to explore my own art more deeply. So thank you very much for this. I really hope that you enjoyed this video because it's given me a lot of pleasure just to be able to put it together. Thank you very much, Adam Boyce and Craig Powell at Tops. This is the first episode in a series that I'm building with the use of the X16 Ginunting, but I will also be pairing it with the Tops Prather buoy. So that's going to be a separate episode in the review of the Tops Prather buoy, but an exploration of the X16 Ginunting would not be complete without an Espada Idaga pairing. So what I'm going to pair this with is the Tops Prather buoy. So looking at this combination here with the X16 Ginunting, going over the previous paradigms, but also with the Tops Prather buoy, I'm going to be exploring some of the Keating Bagwell and some of the Estacada buoy pedagogies, so that when I put them together, I think we're going to find some very interesting things in my study of the X16 Ginunting and the Tops Prather buoy as part of the tools of my own Estacada Filipino martial arts exploration and study. I think you're going to enjoy the series as I start to put this together, and I think that you're going to discover a lot of things, so I do welcome you to be a part of this journey. But the X16 Ginunting in this particular review is something that I really highly recommend. But the most important thing is that really have an open mindset. Don't let that initial feedback of the weight distract you. If that's what you're feeling, you're coming at it from a stick paradigm. Have an open mind, start to take a look at some sword paradigms, and I promise you this X16 Ginunting is really going to open up a lot of possibilities for you. So I really hope that you enjoyed this video. Do stick around, stay tuned, because I promise you there are going to be more videos to come.